The process of accommodating applicants and employees with disabilities involves several steps. Step 1 is to ascertain the need for an accommodation. The employer's first step is to determine whether the employee believes he or she can perform the essential functions of the job but requires a reasonable accommodation to do so. An individual who decides to request accommodation must let the employer know personally or through a representative that he or she needs an adjustment or change at work for a reason related to a medical condition. Next is to ascertain legal rights and responsibilities. If the employee thinks an accommodation is necessary, the employer must determine whether the employee's condition qualifies as a protected disability under the ADA or under a comparable state law. Step 3 is to conduct an interactive dialogue on reasonable accommodation. Employer must engage in an interactive process with the employee and, if necessary, the healthcare professionals to determine whether, as a matter of medical opinion, the employee can perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. An employer may require that the documentation about the disability and the functional limitations come from an appropriate healthcare or rehabilitation professional. Appropriate professionals in any particular situation will depend on the disability and the type of functional limitation it imposes. Appropriate professionals include physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, vocational rehabilitation specialists, and licensed mental health professionals. The role of occupational therapists with special training in ergonomics may make a significant contribution to identifying and implementing effective workplace accommodations by mediating the interactive process between the employer and employee. Next is to decide whether accommodations are reasonable. Assuming the identification of one or more accommodations for enabling the employee to perform the essential functions of the job, the employer should next determine whether the accommodations are reasonable. Step 5 is to consider requiring a health examination. The ADA does not prevent an employer from requiring an individual to go to an appropriate healthcare professional of the employer's choice if the individual provides insufficient information from his or her treating physician or other healthcare professional to substantiate the individual has an ADA disability and needs a reasonable accommodation. However, if the individual provides insufficient documentation in response to the employer's initial request, the employer should explain why the documentation is insufficient and allow the individual to provide the missing information in a timely manner. Documentation is insufficient if it does not specify the existence of an ADA disability and explain the need for reasonable accommodation. Step 6 is to select an accommodation. The employer may choose among reasonable accommodations as long as the chosen accommodation is effective. Thus, as part of the interactive process, the employer may offer alternative suggestions for reasonable accommodations and discuss their effectiveness in removing the workplace barriers impeding the individuals with disability. Last step is to monitor and document the process. The employer should closely monitor the situation to see whether reasonable accommodation is indeed working. Is the employee now able to perform the essential functions of the job? It also protects both the employer and the employee and will serve as a future reference.